Good evening. Thanks for coming here. My name is Dale Soden. I am the director of the Weyerhaeuser Center for Christian Faith and Learning here at Whitworth and the host for tonight's lecture. If you need extra credit in Core 150, I've got a couple sheets outside on the bench, so when you're done, please feel free to put your name on that list, and I will make sure that your instructors get it. Tonight we get to hear from a dear friend and longtime professor of history, Arlin Migliazzo. Arlin and I taught together in the history department. Our offices are just upstairs here for more than 30 years, so this is a special night for me. I'm just so glad that Arlin is here and so glad that you're here. Because as you will hear in a few minutes, Dr. Migliazzo will share some of his insights from his recently published biography on Henrietta Mears, really one of the most remarkable individuals in the history of American religion, and someone who has been generally unrecognized until Arlin decided to do just a prodigious amount of work to bring her really back to life for a significant number of people, many who have known her and have learned new things, but of course many, many people who did not know of her. And in addition to that, the book has been roundly recognized by some of the top scholars in the field of American religious history. So it's really quite an accomplishment. I have a great appreciation and admiration for Arlin's work, which I saw up close and personal. We spent many hours over the years talking about this woman. My office was 2 doors down, and this man spent over 10 years, about 13 years, I suppose to be exact, trying to track down every available lead and source on this woman. He conducted more than 60 interviews with people who shared their memories as well as the influence that she had on them. He painstakingly attempted to find details of life where just a few shreds of evidence existed, and all that for the task of providing a narrative that we could all read and an analysis of the impact of this individual on so many other people that have had themselves great influence in our country. Well, I'll leave it to Arlin to tell you more about this person, but just a few things about Arlin and then just a couple of my own reflections about our friendship through the years. Arlin grew up in Los Angeles, and in retrospect, he is now, because of this study, even more aware of how much influence Henrietta Mears had on him through the various people that she influenced that made an impact on his life. Arlin graduated from Biola University in 1974. He earned a master's in history in 1975 from Northern Arizona University and a PhD in history from Washington State University in 1982. He taught for a short time at Judson College. He was a Fulbright scholar in Korea. He came to Whitworth in 1983 and then retired from the history department in 2017, where he now is an emeritus professor. I could spend a lot of time talking about Arlin's contributions just to Whitworth. He served in many different capacities over his time here, but I think most notably when he served as Director of Faculty Development, he made a large impact in terms of helping our faculty understand what it meant to integrate faith and learning. But Arlin became nationally known in what we know as the Lilly Network, an organization that is dedicated to the nurturing of young faculty, young Christian faculty, and in their journey and their career path toward becoming professors at Christian colleges and universities. And Arlin, frankly, is known nationally for his work as a mentor for many, many younger faculty, and it's just a great legacy that he leaves, not just, again, at Whitworth, but really throughout the country, and is still sought after as a consultant for much of what's continuing to happen in that regard. But it was as a teacher that I think have my greatest appreciation for Arlin, because again, I saw this so much, so close and so personal to me. Arlin has a great passion for history. For anyone, I know a couple of his students are in the audience, a great passion for history. He was never unprepared in over 30 years. I never saw or never felt like any class that he walked into that he was just winging it. He was just a diligent preparer for that particular day's work. He was always trying to excite his students about the study of history, and he set high expectations. Arlin had this reputation of being hard, and it was largely because he set such high expectations for students, but he was always fighting for them. He was relentless in his efforts to help students become better writers and scholars, and students really all over the country who have been his graduates have benefited from his teaching. As a scholar, Arlin has always taken that seriously. So even when at the early stages of his career, where there were many, many demands placed on him as a faculty member here at Whitworth, Arlin never was not working on something or thinking about something from a scholarly perspective. He's written numerous scholarly articles. He has given presentations throughout the decades at uncounted conferences. He's done countless book reviews. But again, it's as a recent scholar in terms of Henrietta Mears that we have come really nationally to know him. Early in his career, he was an editor of Lands of True and Certain Beauty, the geographical theories and colonization strategies of Jean-Pierre Pury. He was an editor of a book that still is being used by people, including us at Whitworth, The Teaching as an Act of Faith, Theory and Practice in Church-Related Higher Education, where he wrote one of the major essays and encouraged faculty from Whitworth and around the country to participate in this. In 2007, the University of South Carolina Press publishes To Make This Land Our Own, Community, Identity, and Cultural Adaptation in Perrysburg Township, South Carolina, 1732 to 1865. And then, of course, the title of tonight's lecture, Erdman's published Mother of Modern Evangelicalism, The Life and Legacy of Henrietta Mears. I'm so happy for Arlin. When you see somebody work this hard and for such a long period of time, to try and again to do justice to a significant woman who really, again, had been unrecognized, and then to see the way in which this book's been received is really quite gratifying. I'll just read two brief comments. George Marsden, really one of the deans of American religious history, wrote this: "We have long needed a first-rate biography of Henrietta Mears. She is indeed one of the most influential architects of the, quote, new evangelical renewal that reshaped much of American fundamentalist heritage after World War II. Arlin Migliazzo has done a truly impressive amount of research and presents a fascinatingly detailed portrait of an inspiring teacher and irrepressible leader." Grant Wacker, of a younger generation of now leading American scholars of American religious history: "This deeply researched and lucidly written volume illumines the life of one of the most important but least examined figures in the early history of American and world evangelicalism. The continuities between Mears' multiple contributions and the far more heralded career of Billy Graham, for example, are simply astonishing. Migliazzo writes with an empathetic yet not uncritical engagement. He provides a wonderful addition to our understanding of American religious history in general, and to the history of women in the formation of evangelicalism in particular." I just say personally, thank you for being such a great colleague. I could not have had a better one for these 30 years that we've been together. And thank you for being such a great friend, so supportive all of these years. And again, it's just it's been a great privilege. So please join me in welcoming Arlin Migliazzo.
who was that guy? Wow. Thanks, Dale. I appreciate that. It's been a great career here. I had a wonderful time at Whitworth, and it's nice that we're still in town. When our son and his family moved back to Spokane, we thought, we don't have to go anywhere. We can stay right here. So it's been really great to continue to be part of Whitworth. I want to thank Dale for inviting me to do this. He has been along for much of the ride. He's seen, again, the early stages of this research to its conclusion. I also thank my wife, Judy, who's been my home for 45 years now. And she's had to share that home with, or I've had to share that home with Henrietta for a while. And I appreciate her forbearance because she's lived with Henrietta as long as I have. And she could probably tell you the same stories I'll tell you tonight. She's heard that much about her. But the title of tonight's kind of conversation is that she's a forgotten person. And I want to parse that out as we go along tonight. In retrospect, it seems odd that a woman who so significantly transformed theologically conservative Protestantism in the 20th century could be so easily forgotten in our own time. It's amazing because there are people alive today that will tell you that the only reason that the Hollywood freeway, this is a Hollywood freeway, and we're looking southeast toward downtown Los Angeles. You'll notice the Hollywood freeway comes off Cahuenga Pass from the San Fernando Valley, makes this arc to miss downtown Hollywood, and then instead of going toward LA, it makes this jog to the left like this, and then it'll come back around and jog back downtown LA. Now, you may wonder why it does that. There are people today, and of course I hit it in the wrong spot here. There are people today that still believe that the reason that freeway does that, this is Hollywood, this is US 101, okay, is because Henrietta Mears had such a huge reputation and was so influential that she convinced the urban planners to arc that freeway so it would miss, there it is, that particular building and its campus. That's Hollywood First Presbyterian Church, okay? And you can still find people today that believe that the reason that happened was because of her influence. She was such a formidable presence in the post-World War II era that's the kind of reputation that she has. Now, I tried to track down whether that was true or not. I couldn't find it. But the very fact that is out there tells you something about how important she was. She truly was a remarkable person. She assumed key leadership positions, nearly always filled by men during her time. Here she is on the left at a board meeting, and you can see who's front and center with that nice fancy hat, the only woman in the whole group of this board. She spoke to audiences across the country and around the world on a variety of faith-related topics. And you might say, why? Well, let's just look at a few things that she did. First of all, she built the largest Sunday school in the denomination at the First Presbyterian Church of Hollywood. It had over 6,000 members by 1962. It was one of the 10 largest Protestant Sunday schools in the country. I think the most amazing statistic here is this last one. It grew by 250% in her first 4 years, 1928 to 1932. And you can see that the population of that Sunday school went from 1,624 to well over 4,100 in that first 4 years. She also founded one of the largest independent religious publishing companies in the country called Gospel Light. She did that in 1933. Within 5 years of its founding, when its first warehouse was that small garage in Hollywood that you see there on the left, the Gospel Light Press was already supplying hundreds of thousands of Sunday school books to over 1,500 churches representing 42 different denominations in 43 states. By the end of 1940, Gospel Light sold over 1.7 of those lesson books to more than 2,100 churches from every state except Alabama. It was the only state that didn't buy any of that stuff. And it got larger from there. The 5 full-time employees and 2 part-time employees in 1941 became 40 by 1956 when Gospel Light moved to that 6-story building in Glendale you see in the other picture there. 2 years later, the staff had grown to over 100, exporting Sunday school materials around the world by that time. She created an international interdenominational retreat center that before COVID hosted 60,000 plus participants each year. Now, thousands and thousands of folks have been to Forest Home Christian Conference Center over the years. We have no way of knowing how many of those folks were completely altered by her experience, but one person certainly was at the 1949 College Briefing Conference. That fine young gentleman in white is Billy Graham. This happened just before the 1949 Los Angeles Crusade, and he had a crisis of faith that Mears helped him resolve in the summer before that crusade, and that crusade is the one that really launched his career in full-scale evangelism, worldwide evangelism. She co-founded the first organized ministry to media celebrities called the Hollywood Christian Group. That was in 1949. First meeting was in her home. About 24 people met, celebrities, producers, folks affiliated with the industry. And 10 years later, when they celebrated the 10th anniversary, over 200 people were at that conference that was held in the Knickerbocker Hotel in Hollywood. Major stars of the era, and some of younger folks won't know these names, some of you older folks might, but on the left side there, that's Roy Rogers and Dale Evans, two of the biggest kind of stars in the Western kind of genre of the era. This is the 40s and 50s and 60s. On the right, you have Tim Spencer, who was a member of the Sons of the Pioneers. The Sons of the Pioneers was kind of your basic Western rock group of the 30s and 40s and 50s. He was a member of that group, along with a guy named Roy Rogers, and became its manager a little bit later on. This is Colleen Townsend, who was an early star that became very much associated with Mears at Hollywood First Presbyterian Church. And for those of you, again, that have a little more age on you, that's Jane Russell, who was one of the major film stars of that era. She was also very much part of this Hollywood Christian group that Mears had helped co-found. In 1961, long before anyone had thought about decolonization of the mission movement or the global Christian movement, Henrietta Mears founded a nonprofit to strengthen Christian education programs worldwide and to train indigenous leaders in their own languages. This is GLINT, or Gospel Light International. In spite of these successful ventures, she always placed her relationships over institutions or programs. And so her greatest contribution to 20th century Christianity probably is reflected best by those she mentored in one way or another. Billy Graham, for example, again, that's the person with a hand in the air there on the left. Billy Graham called her the greatest female influence in his life outside of his wife or his mother. Some of you may be involved even today in Young Life International. Well, the person in the middle is Jim Rayburn, who started Young Life International. He also said at many points in his life that she was the biggest influence on him developing the Young Life organization. The person on the right there, Bill Bright, started what was called at the time Campus Crusade for Christ. He actually started in Henrietta Mears' home. He and his wife lived with Henrietta Mears for about a decade. And he developed the whole Campus Crusade for Christ curriculum under her guidance. So these are three folks that were very influential in the 20th century kind of explosion of modern evangelicalism, and she mentored in her own way all three of them. But they weren't the only ones. She was a mentor to nearly 400 other young men and women who entered full-time Christian service. And again, some of those names may be familiar to some of you. Again, those are folks of earlier generations that were very, very influential in the development of what we today would call modern evangelicalism. She was a charter member of the National Association of Evangelicals National Sunday School Association in 1946. She was actually the only woman at the organizing conference of that national group to speak. No other women got to speak, but she did because of her influence. She was an elected member of the Commission on International Relations of the National Association of Evangelicals and also on the advisory board for the World Evangelical Fellowship. When those two organizations merged in 1957, she became an advisory member of that particular group also. She again was so busy she didn't have time to write too much, but she did develop in her Sunday school curriculum the beginnings of a book. That book has become what the Bible is all about. There are 4 million copies in circulation now in at least 4 different editions. And you can go up to Amazon and see, I think there are actually more than 4 up there now. But again, that's a very important contribution for her and for the development of biblical literacy in the 20th and 21st century. All these accomplishments aren't to mention the fact that she was offered and turned down professorships at the most prestigious theologically conservative Christian college in the country, Wheaton College, and also at the largest theologically conservative seminary in the country, Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. But she had no formal training in theology or Christian education and no graduate degree in any subject. And yet she was offered professorships that she said, no, I'm going to stay in the local church. She collaborated with Colleen Townsend, who was the founder of Wycliffe Bible Translators, Bob Pierce, who was an architect of World Vision and also founded Samaritan's Purse, and Dawson Trotman, who founded the Navigators Bible Study organization. Again, it's an international organization. Some of you know Raja Tanas. Raja Tanas from the Middle East actually was involved in the Navigators program for quite a while. She counted the governors of California, Oregon, and Washington among her supporters, and she got telegrams from people like Dwight Eisenhower, who just happened to be the President of the United States in the 1950s. So this woman, it's kind of amazing. Maybe it is more plausible to realize, well, maybe that legend really is true. Maybe she really did bend that freeway somehow. And you can see how close this is the church right here, or one of the church buildings. That's the freeway being built, and there it is constructed, and there's that Gothic tower right there. So it's right next to the Hollywood freeway. But it makes it even more interesting to figure out, why isn't she more well known today? Why is this woman who had that kind of influence, that wide-ranging influence for so many years over so many people's lives, why don't we know much about her? Well, let's take a look at her formative years. I think they're the important ones for our consideration tonight. Henrietta Cornelia Mears was born October 23rd, 1890. She was the youngest of 7 kids, born to Margaret Burtis Everett Mears and Elisha Ashley Mears. Her father had moved to Chicago. Whoops, I'm sorry, I should have done that. Her father moved to Chicago in the early 1860s and got involved in the hardware business, and actually did quite well in the Civil War years in the hardware business in the Chicago area. He attended regularly the First Baptist Church of Chicago, which had a very prominent minister at that time. In fact, that minister was the father of the woman he started to get interested in at First Baptist. And not only did he get interested in Margaret, he also began to operate with her father a speculative land development program in the area North Shore, north of Chicago, and that today is Highwood, Illinois. They actually started that town by developing land and building homes in that area just north of Chicago today. Margaret and Elisha married on New Year's Eve in 1868, and over the next couple of decades, they welcomed 6 children into their family. Elisha completely gave up the hardware business for the lucrative real estate and mortgage sales industry, and in 1883 moved his family to Ipswich in Dakota Territory, where land hunger of the settlers boded well for his rising ambitions. The farmers, folks wanted to come in and farm. He was the one to be able to sell them the land and get them going with loans. In 1887, there we go. In 1887, they relocated to Minot, which is where he founded a number of banks that included the First National Bank of Minot, that building in the foreground without paint. In 1889, they moved to Fargo, and it's there that Henrietta was born in 1890. Over the next few years, her father built an extensive financial empire that included more than 20 businesses, banks, mortgage companies, he even owned a livestock company, so he was really diversifying himself during these early years. At the height of his influence, he extended a tremendous amount of power into that whole land sales, mortgage sales industry in the Dakotas. But some of his apparently legitimate business practices danced on the edge of illegality. And again, it's tricky when we look back on banking is so regulated today. It really wasn't very much then. It was kind of a wide open deal, especially in these new territories and new states. The North and South Dakota come into the Union in 1889. But back then, it was, maybe this is legit, maybe it's not. I don't have time to kind of tell you all the things that were going on, but suffice it to say that he was under such a suspect reputation that the Bankers Association of North Dakota expelled him from membership because they thought he was doing things that weren't legal. But 2 weeks later, he was elected vice president of the American Bankers Association representing North Dakota. So is this guy a flim-flam man, or is he a legit businessman? I mean, again, you could kind of take your money and take your choice. But it all began unraveling in 1893. 1893 was the year that the U.S. entered its worst economic recession to that point in time. It was really a devastating 4 or 5 year economic downturn for the country. In May of 93, the feds actually shut down 2 of his banks. He had actually created a very, very nice building here. This is called the Mears Block. It's in Fargo. And you can see it's a very nice building, very fancy. It was kind of the headquarters for all of his other banks around the state. But 2 of those banks were declared insolvent, shut down by the feds. Less than a week later, a devastating fire destroyed all of downtown Fargo, and all that was left of the Mears Block is this arch. So they were struggling as a family. Through much of the 1890s, Mears was taken to court 24 times, again, based on some of the concerns that some of the folks that he had loaned money to and that hadn't been able to live up to his specifications. They brought suit against him, and when you adjust the judgments against him for our current time, he was in debt over $250,000. He owed $250,000 to these folks, and so he tried to repair his reputation. He traveled a lot. He actually spent time in jail in Kittitas County, up here in the state of Washington, near Ellensburg, because of some potential, again, banking problems. He only spent a few weeks there, but the very fact he spent time in jail again tells you that, again, his operations may have been a little bit less than legitimate. Her father's predicament and his long absences, on top of the death of her oldest brother and sister, before Henrietta was very old at all, combined with a number of health problems and challenged the family's equilibrium, led to a pretty unstable young life for Henrietta. By the time this picture was taken, the picture on the left was taken, she had already moved 7 times. They lived in 7 different homes, again, when she was a young girl. Over the course of her march to adulthood, they finally settled in Minneapolis, where they attended the First Baptist Church, and Henrietta became a member of that church before she was 10 years old. But she experienced numerous physical ailments in her own body. She had debilitating nosebleeds that would really weaken her very greatly. She almost died of muscular rheumatism, killed her best friend when she was a little kid, almost killed her. She had eye problems. Probably some of that was genetic, but then she didn't help things by when she was getting dressed, when she was, I think she was getting ready for church. And, you know, women back then wore hats, and they had these big long pins they'd put in the hats to hold them in place if the wind came up. Somehow she poked herself in the eye with a hat pin and drove it right into her pupil. So there was a thought she would be blind in that eye within a couple of years, and probably in both eyes before she turned 20. Fortunately, that didn't happen. By the time that she graduated from the University of Minnesota, it's her senior picture, both parents had died. So she lost both of her parents. She lost a brother and a sister before she was 22. Her life of uncertainty and instability, I think, was anchored by her faith. She was deeply committed to her faith in Christ, and that was a very important part of her life, the most important part of her life. After she graduated in chemistry from the University of Michigan, she taught at 3 different schools. North Branch is a town about 40 miles north of Minneapolis, right on the Wisconsin border, little tiny rural town. She taught there. That's the entire school that you see there. So grades 1 through 12 were all there, and she was the principal as well as the chemistry teacher. The Beardsley School is in eastern, extreme eastern Minnesota. She was there a couple years, And then she came back to Minneapolis and spent a number of years teaching at Central High School. Now, her kind of chaotic and troubling adolescence and early adulthood coincided with a major crisis in the Christian church, which played out with particular bitterness in the U.S. Just real quickly, the red demonstrates there are these crisis points in the church. Just a couple of them that I want to mention, and then I want to spend a little bit of time on the last one. 1054, the Christian church was unified until 1054, and then it split in half. And some of you may have heard of the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Orthodox Church, or the Roman Catholic Church. And then, of course, in 1517, the Catholic Church split, and you have, again, the Roman Catholic Church continuing, but then that's where all the Protestant churches, Martin Luther and John Calvin and all the folks that you learn about in our theology classes here at Whitworth, that's when they were really dominant and actually broke away from the Catholic Church, John Knox and folks like that. But then that last one, the 1870s to 1920s, I said, is another pivotal crisis time for the church. And this is what Henrietta lived through. This is a time when the church itself, because of modern science and various kinds of theories, Darwinian evolutionary theory, geographical theories, geological theories of Lyell and some other folks, these started to kind of cause people to think, well, maybe Christianity needs to adjust with the time. And so you get this split in the church, again, particularly dominant in the United States, but not just the U.S., into theological liberalism, which is also called modernism, or theological conservatism, which is often called fundamentalism. Okay, so we have that split. And again, it takes a while. It kind of begins in the 70s, but by the 1920s, it was pretty rancorous and destructive. Well, theological liberals and theological conservatives, what's the difference? Theological liberals or modernists claim that central historic beliefs, such as the authority of the Bible, the virgin birth, divinity, and bodily resurrection of Christ, need to change with the times. Okay, maybe those things really didn't happen, or maybe we have to rethink those sorts of things. Theological conservatives, the fundamentalists, claim that these central historic Christian beliefs must be maintained no matter what or how the times change. So you have this split in the church. Just as Henrietta, again, is getting to adulthood, it becomes very prominent in the 1920s. You may have heard of the Scopes Monkey Trial, for example. That happens in the middle of that decade when she's teaching at Central High School. So you have this split in the church, and it just so happened that the home church of Henrietta Mears and her family in Minneapolis was First Baptist Church, which was the home church or the pastorate of William Bell Riley. Riley was one of the most significant of the fundamentalists of this early period. He helped found the world fundamentalist movement, and he was he was the senior pastor of this church that Henrietta grew to maturity in. She grew to maturity under his teaching, but when she returned to Minneapolis in 1916 as a 26-year-old, she brought her own perspectives on living out the faith that began to challenge some key fundamentalist assumptions, and we'll talk about those in just a bit. In Minneapolis, while attending this church, she became a real prominent leader in Central High School. She was a senior advisor for a number of years. There, she did all kinds of social and educational activities for her students. She was a person that believed in helping the students educate themselves, kind of a progressive educator for that particular period of time. At the same time she was doing that, she took over a class of how should we say this? They were unruly, young women. They were kind of high school, early college-age women, so late teens, early 20s. And they were not pleasant to work with. In fact, Henrietta's sister taught this group for a while, and she just got fed up with them. She said, I can't deal with these folks. So she gave them to Henrietta. Well, Henrietta took this little group, and after a reorganization of the Sunday school, this Fidelis Sunday school class became the most popular, class that had the highest enrollment of any of the classes, Sunday school classes in the church, the entire church. So you can see that in early 1917, there were 5 members of the class. That's when Margaret gave it to her sister. Henrietta takes over. They reorganize the Sunday school. There's one person in fall of 1917. And then look what happens to the enrollment after that, okay? It just skyrockets. And I'm not sure if you can read all these stats. You probably can't, especially if you're in the back of the room. But the Fidelis class is the third one listed here. And if you look across the line here, they had the biggest enrollment. They had the most members present, they had the most visitors, and they gave the most to the church on this particular Sunday. And that's her class of young women now. The class was so popular and got so large that in 1923, First Baptist Church of Minneapolis built an addition. And they built an auditorium in this addition. That auditorium became Henrietta Mears' classroom for her Fidelis young women. There was room for 400 in that area. And if you can see kind of in the middle of the picture, this light area, that was the overflow section. Well, on October 11, 1925, even the overflow room overflowed because she had 532 young women in that class. Okay? So what's drawing these folks? I think her vibrant faith, her innovative Bible teaching, and her emphasis on servant leadership long before that term gained any popularity, that's what caused this Sunday school class to grow so large. I think also these Fidelis young women were drawn to Mears and her teaching because it was her ability to recast theological conservatism, in other words, historic Orthodox Christianity, in ways that recast it for the present time. She didn't change the doctrines. She changed how we thought about evangelism and these doctrines. It was this new conception of Christianity that took her to Hollywood, this modern evangelicalism that took her to Hollywood in 1928. Well, what's the difference in between evangelicalism and fundamentalism? Well, I've got a couple of definitions that tell you a little bit, and then one that will hopefully tell you completely what's going on. George Marsden kind of quips in one of his books that a fundamentalist is an evangelical who's angry about something, okay? Philip Yancey, who some of you know wrote for Christianity Today, has written a number of books, just got a new book out now. He said an evangelical is a fundamentalist with a better income, slightly more open mind, and a less furrowed brow. Well, those are cute, but they don't really tell us anything, do they? Essentially, the difference between fundamentalists and evangelicals is their perspective on the relationship of Christians to the culture in which they live. It's not theological. Theologically, they agree on pretty much everything, not everything, but pretty much everything, the important doctrines. But it's their approach to culture. How do we think about culture and our relationship as Christians to it? Well, Henrietta Mears is this new kind of theological conservative, this new modern evangelical. And I would argue that she is one of the progenitors of that particular perspective. She's doing this very early in the teens and 20s and 30s. And I think that's very significant. 5 hallmarks of evangelicalism, Henrietta Mears' brand of evangelicalism. First, you have to nurture the inner life of faith. This, again, is where historic Christianity, the whole notion of faith in Christ and what that means for us, is really important. And evangelism, bringing other people into Christianity. She said the Christian life is not trying to be good or trying to be like Jesus. It's seeking to have a deeper experience of fellowship with Christ. She also said if he's not Lord of all, he's not Lord at all. So again, you have this sense that all for Jesus, this kind of idea. So this is really the foundation stone of her evangelical notion. You have to bring people into the kingdom, and they have to be discipled. They need to learn that Christ is Lord of all. But secondly, she believed that you need to serve a blessed and a broken world. Again, a quotation from Mears. The first time they take a basket of food to that person who's in need, the first time they go out to win somebody to Christ, the first time they have a little club of underprivileged children, they come back thrilled and their lives aglow. Now, Mears always believed that evangelism was first, but she also believed that meant once a person is evangelized, once a person is a Christian, then we've got to serve the world. And her college department, which grew again to over 800 members at Hollywood First Church, did all kinds of service opportunities. They worked in jails. They went to mission organizations that served the underprivileged. They taught language classes for folks that were new immigrants to the country. She also developed a deputation program that ultimately she's going to contribute collegians to a deputation to war-torn Europe and Asia after the Second World War. This kind of world deputation program takes folks to work camps to help rebuild parts of Japan, parts of Germany in the years after the war. So she very much believed in service to the world. She also believed that we had to thoughtfully engage secular culture. Okay, again, quotation from Henrietta Mears. If I would get up in Hollywood and tell people that they shouldn't go to movies and they shouldn't do this and they shouldn't do that and all that sort of thing, do you know I wouldn't have any following at all? But you know what I can do? I can tell them, young people, God demands everything. And he wants you to give him absolutely everything you have. Put him first. When you put the cross where it belongs and you let young people bow there and not merely give up a lot of superficial things in life, those things fall away. One of her college department members that later became the LA City Attorney, Roger Arnenberg, said Christianity didn't force us to give up other things, but Christianity crowded out the things that were inconsistent with being a Christian. Much better things that made a happier and a fuller and a richer life. So we can engage with secular culture. She never feared it. She didn't want her students to fear secular culture. Don't be afraid of the culture, but be wise. And this is a woman who, for example, borrowed sex education films from the LA City School District to teach her students about sexuality. This is 1940s and 1950s. She brought philosophers in to talk to her college students and go to her camp conferences. She brought in psychologists. She was never afraid of the culture because she believed that Christianity had answers that people needed. She also valued the life of the mind. She thought it was very important to exercise your intellectual abilities. Again, quotations from her. I think this is a great one. I love this one. I want you to grow intellectually. Christians, by and large, are apt to be stupid and ignorant. She's talking to Christians when she's telling it, by the way. I always tell young men and women in college not to dare to speak out in college against anything that's taught them unless they're an A student. God put no premium on ignorance, and if we're to become leaders of this age, we must keep abreast. And then, we haven't given young people really a reason for their faith. And so instead of having it built, wisdom being the very foundation of it, notice that, wisdom being the very foundation of it, we discover that they meet a little more of the intellectual power as far as the world is concerned, and then there becomes intellectual frustration, and here we are left. She didn't want her students necessarily to go to a Christian college unless that's where God was directing them. She sent students to Columbia, UCLA, USC, all these, Schoenard's art school, some of the best institutions in the entire country, because she said, students, you don't need to fear ideas. You don't need to fear. Why? Because she believed that the Sunday school was Christ's college. If the church is doing its job and meeting students where they are, at whatever level they are, then you don't have to worry about any ideas that are going to be out there. And you can explore all those ideas because Christ has the answers. Again, she called the Sunday school Christ's college. For her, if the church was doing its job, Christians would be fine, studying whatever they wanted to study, wherever they wanted to study it. So this was the new evangelicalism that Mears began practicing in Minnesota in the teens and 20s, brought it to Southern California from the First Presbyterian Church, and exported it from there to the world. For her, the focus was always the Christian education program of the local church. She always had her focus at the local church. All other facets of her contributions to Christianity proceeded outward from there. Gospel Light, Forest Home, Hollywood Christian Group, Glint, the National Association of Evangelicals, on and on. It all started for her trying to develop a better Christian education program for her students in the Sunday school at First Presbyterian. By the time of her death in March of 1963, her impact spanned the globe and was felt with particular strength on the West Coast, including Spokane and, yes, even Whitworth. I went through the yearbook from 1946 to 1963, and these are folks associated with Mears that approached that spoke at various functions here at Whitworth. And again, you can look at that list. Most of those names you may not know, but notice in 1949, Jim Rayburn came here, spoke. Notice in 1952, Gary Demarest, who was then at the University Press in Seattle, came to work. Gary Demarest became a trustee, or on the board of trustees, the board of Whitworth University for years. In 1956, Henrietta came and spoke at the Women's Conference. Frank Warren, our president, spoke at a number of Mears' conferences, particularly in 1958. And in 1963, Dale Bruner, who was a longtime theology professor here at Whitworth, spoke before. This is 10 years before he came to Whitworth, but he came up to speak. Dale Bruner actually lived with Mears for quite a while. Some of you might recognize other folks from Whitworth that were, again, Mears boys, as they were called. There were some Mears girls too, but they were mostly boys. This is Darrell Guter, who was our dean here back in the 80s. He left Whitworth and ended up as dean at Princeton Theological Seminary. Darrell just retired a short while ago and now lives over in Seattle. There's Frank Warren, again, speaking at one of the conferences at Mears' place. This is Dale Bruner right here. He during his years at Princeton. And this is President Lindemann, who was president of Whitworth back in the 70s, conferring a degree on Lloyd Ogilvie, who at that point was the head pastor at the church, First Presbyterian Church of Hollywood. We have a number of chaplains that were also part of Mears' group. We just lost Ron Fraze this last Friday. Ron died. He was 97 years old. Ron was the chaplain and the sociology prof here. He started the CAST program, for those of you that know about the Latin American program. Ron started that program, very involved with Mears, and it's a dear friend to many of us. After Ron, a guy named Terry McGonigal, some of you might know Terry McGonigal. Terry McGonigal, who counseled at her camp, was chaplain at Whitworth for a number of years, and so was his soon-to-be wife, Suzette McGonigal. So again, the connections go pretty far. There are lots of others. Howard Lois Redmond. Howard was a theology prof here for years. Bruce and Diane Murphy in the history department. Jim and Linda Hunt in the history department. Jack Burns, Gail Fielding, Forrest Baird, Jim Edwards, Meredith Shimizu, Ron Pyle, Bill and Bonnie Robinson. I mean, you could go on and on with people that were affected by her or her mentees or her proteges. If you were ever involved in FCA, if you were ever involved in Athletes in Action, if you were ever associated with Young Life or Campus Crusade, if you ever used gospel-like materials when you were teaching VBS or in Sunday school, if you've ever been to La Jolla Press or National Press in Washington, D.C., First Press Spokane, Westside Church Richland, First Press Seattle, or University Press Seattle, First Baptist in Pomona, First Press Berkeley, La Jolla Press, Coalinga Press, First Press Fresno. Any of these churches, if you were involved with any of those organizations or churches, you were involved with Henrietta Mears without knowing it. So I come back to the initial question, why is she so unknown today? Why has she been forgotten by so many contemporary evangelicals? Well, let me posit a few suggestions. Well, to be blunt, she was a woman. And among some contemporary evangelicals, for some reason, that's a problem. Okay, so that's maybe one potential problem. Secondly, as is so often the case, mothers seem secondary to the reputations of their sons and daughters, just like teachers are often eclipsed by the achievements of their students. I think another reason might be that she was dwarfed by her own accomplishments, not in her own day, but in the following generation. And let me just give myself as an example. Dale mentioned that I was affected by Mears. I didn't know I was affected by Mears. But as I started this research, I realized, first of all, I grew up in Southern California, lived in Southgate and Linwood. Our home church was St. John's United Press in Compton, California. My home church, its senior pastor, its assistant pastor, and our Christian education director were all Mears guys. Okay, they've all been taught by Mears. I was raised on gospel light educational materials. I went to Forest Home College Briefing Conference. I first came to Washington to serve as summer youth assistant in a church that was, headed by one of her second generation proteges. In fact, that's where I met Judy. She was attending that church, and that's where I met her. Not at the time, but a little later on. There are so many ways that Mears affected my life. In fact, partly because of my involvement in that church, I think that's part of the reason I ended up at Whitworth University, because the pastor and the pastor's wife, as well as all three of their progeny, came to Whitworth, and they kind of convinced me maybe this is a place I should think about. Fortunately, it worked out for me to be here for my career, but it was partly because of Mears' influence, if you can believe that. These all could be contributing reasons as to why Mears has been forgotten by so many in today's evangelical church, but I think there's another more central and I think more tragic reason. If I go back to the crisis diagram here, I've added these two here. So here we stopped earlier looking at the 20s. You have liberals, you have conservatives, but I think that something else has happened in the time since. Fundamentalists, there are still fundamentalists. They exist to this day. But notice that when I talk about evangelicals, I'm talking about Mearsian evangelicals here, the folks who had those 5 characteristics. You notice I highlighted 1970s. I think the evangelical movement begins to drift in the 1970s in ways that are difficult. Since the 70s, I'm afraid that the Mears brand of evangelicalism has been pushed to the periphery, and that, I think, has brought the church, the evangelical movement, to a crossroads in our contemporary time. I'm still an evangelical, but I'm not happy about it. And I'm not sure Mears would be either. She certainly had her blind spots, and like all of us, she walked on feet of clay. But I think she got some things right that today's evangelicals need to be reminded about. First, for Mears, theology always took precedence over ideology, no matter what the ideology was: liberal, conservative, radical, reactionary. She'd seen them all in her lifetime. She'd seen them all during her lifetime. For her to be right with humanity, we have to first be right with God. So Mears would remind us that our theological convictions should direct our lives in the world, not our lives in the world direct our theological convictions. And I think some evangelicals today have kind of missed that. I think secondly, because Mears believed that Christians need not fear ideas or the wider culture, she could speak confidently into the culture with courage and compassion, not with anger or vitriol. She was convinced that the church had the answers. You didn't have to yell at someone, or you didn't have to put down somebody to convey that, and she didn't do that. I think also Mears never confused citizenship in the kingdom of God with citizenship in the nation. The kingdom always took precedence. She had political ideas, she had social ideas, she had economic ideas, and she would share those with some of the folks that were really close to her, but she never taught on those kinds of things, okay? Because she didn't want her particular notions to get in the way of the gospel, and then as the gospel was understood by these folks, to allow the Holy Spirit then to guide their thinking in terms of where they should serve or how they should think about their lives in this world. She also worked hard to bring people together, to find common ground. She cast a wide net. I mean, there were folks that she befriended, that worked with, that other folks wouldn't look at twice. So many people, when she co-founded the Hollywood Christian Group, thought she was just doing terrible things. In fact, I've got some great quotes that I don't have a chance to share with you, that people just hated her because she actually tried to convince people that Hollywood had some Christians in it. And how can you speak out against Hollywood if there are actually Christians in Hollywood? It becomes really difficult. And some of the letters to the editor just rival some of the letters to the editor and some of our rancorous times today. She worked to bring people together. I think that in the time that she lived, particularly in the 50s, there was a real strong anti-Catholic bent to a number of fundamentalists and also some evangelicals. And the fact that Mears really towed the line on that, she was not someone that would speak out against Catholics. She would not be someone that would speak out against faith healers. In fact, Oral Roberts, who was a major faith healer of the time, was in her home a number of times. So she tried to bring people together. I think this is best illustrated in 1954 when she was nominated to receive the Mary Margaret O'Brien Project's prize. And what's this? The Mary Margaret McBride Prize was given to women who did the most to help their community thrive. And it was a cooperative venture nationally of Protestant women, Catholic women, and Jewish women. And in 1954, Mears was nominated for that particular prize. Which way do we go? Let me leave you with the last paragraph in the book. Henrietta Mears modeled a needed charity in that earlier era, one not so dissimilar to our own rancorous time. Between the 19-teens and the 1960s, she remained at the front line of Protestant Christians willing to engage secular American culture in ways that set her apart from those who advocated a bellicose separatism between true Christians and everyone else. She veered off the path taken by her iconoclastic contemporaries toward a gentler but no less orthodox expression of Christianity. Rather than erect barriers meant to separate, Mears fashioned bridges to connect in innovative, sometimes startling ways. And she did so with a generosity of spirit largely absent from the greater theologically conservative American Protestant community. In so doing, Henrietta Mears championed evangelical orthodoxy while simultaneously defending the necessity of intellectual vitality, embracing domestic and international social service, shunning inflammatory rhetoric, and forging alliances with those quite different from herself. 21st century Americans, whether people of faith or not, could do worse than emulate her uncommon grace in troubling and uncertain times. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes for some questions or comments for Arlin, and I'll keep the microphone to you as best I can.
Arlin, thanks so much for this talk. This was great. I have a question about that. I suppose is partly just a question about my curiosity of some things that Mears was up to, but it's also a question about the broader narration you offered at the end about the persistence of fundamentalism into our own moment, and perhaps the loss of neo-evangelical distinctives in the 1970s. It seems to me that in recent years there's been a move from some historians to trouble that distinction between the neo-evangelicals and fundamentalists by pointing to issues around race, consumerism, the New Deal. I'm wondering on issues of race, for example, how did Mears interface with those issues either in California, and would she have been someone that was more like Billy Graham in that, and sort of his quietism on the civil rights movement, even as he's urging more compassion, or something altogether different?
Yeah, it's a good question, Aaron. Yeah. I think to understand Mears, we have to understand how central evangelism was to her in discipleship. If we understand that, first you get people in the kingdom and then you disciple them so that they are essentially 100% behind the Christian message, then you leave it to the Holy Spirit to help those folks decide where they're going to serve. And I think, Mears herself, I asked I did 60-some interviews with folks. Every time I asked, did she ever teach on politics or race or women or whatever? And to a person, they said no. Now, some of her close folks knew what she believed about those kind of things. But she never taught on it because she didn't want things to get mixed up. Her whole point was if you have the faith, the Holy Spirit will guide you in the way you should go. She, she had feet of clay when she was in Minneapolis. Her young women produced these kind of like newsletter, booklet kind of things. And I found some racist jokes in there, some really bad racist jokes. How can there be a good one, right? I mean, but they were really, really very virulent. Even in Hollywood in the 40s, they had colonial kind of dinners, and they had blackface. So this is not a person that she's not a 2020s kind of person. Okay, she's got some blind spots. But she also, at the same time, when I talked to Gary Demarest, for example, I interviewed Gary Demarest, and Gary and his wife, Marilee, said, we think if she had lived longer, she died in 63, that's just as the fair housing movement in California was really getting underway, the Rumford Fair Housing Act and these sorts of things. And they said, we think if she lived longer, she would have been a civil rights person. But I talked to others and said, well, I'm not so sure. So I think her personal record with regard to race is really quite mixed. I mean, a lot of the really bad stuff, I mean, it kind of filtered away as we get into the 40s and the 50s. But still, that was a blind spot. But again, a number of folks that were under her guidance did become involved in the California fair housing fight. Louis Evans and Coke Evans, they went down to La Jolla First Press, and they were really involved there. Ron Fraze, I mentioned Ron Fraze was also involved in the fair housing fight. Bob Munger, who was one of her guys who was at University Church in Seattle for years, wanted open housing in Seattle. So the folks that she helped nurture went in directions she herself didn't go. She said at one point, I've got to be careful. Well, she didn't say that, but I mean, she said to one of her friends, if some people knew that I wore lipstick and makeup, they wouldn't let me come and speak in their church. So here's a woman who's trying to negotiate this weird kind of situation in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so she kind of backed off, I think, on some things she could have certainly spoken out about. But she was fully behind a lot of her folks that did get involved in some of these other things. I remember she said, or Dale Bruner once told me, Dale voted Democratic. Mears was probably a Republican. The only hint that I have of her politics is a little comment in one of her diaries when Franklin Roosevelt won another term, and she wasn't really happy about that at all. But Dale Bruner said that he once heard that even though he lived with her, she knew him, and he was like a son to her. She said to someone, how could anybody be a Democrat, and be a Christian? So she may have had some of those kind of thoughts. She always kept them to herself. Did I answer the whole thing?
Yeah,
I think I got
that's
part
great.
of it.
That's great. Yeah.
Keith?
Just work our way down the line. Arlin, thank you so much for your talk. This is fascinating, and I have tons of questions. I'll try to stick just to one. And it's on something you touched on a little bit already, your comment that she said that if some people knew that she wore lipstick and makeup, they would not invite her to speak in their church. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how she navigated conservative evangelical spaces as a female religious leader. And related to that, I'm particularly interested to know was she married at any point in her life? Because historically, being either married or single as a female religious leader, there are assets to that, there are drawbacks to that. So could you tell us a little bit more about that aspect of her work?
Okay, let me talk about the romantic part first. Okay, so I have no record of her, stepping out with young men before she was a teacher. When she was in North Branch, she was 23, and she started stepping out with a young man. He was a banker. And this is one of the stories that a lot of people have heard over the years, but they never heard the whole story. I was able to get a hold of an interview that was done in 1956 with her, and this is the only time I ever was able to find out anything about this guy, aside from the fact that she said that, I didn't marry because St. Paul was already taken, or he was already gone, or something. But she'd do those kind of quips. But this fella, I could never find his name out. I couldn't ever figure out who it was, but I did find out he was Roman Catholic. Now, she's going out with she's a Protestant in 1914, going out with a Roman Catholic in this little town in northern Minnesota. That really didn't happen very much. And they were quite serious. So ultimately, she realized that this isn't going to work. We're just too different. But I think she also met the Pope in the 1920s when she took a trip to Europe. So she had more contact with Roman Catholicism and Roman Catholics than a lot of other Protestants did. So there was an openness to her with regard to Roman Catholicism through this young man. They didn't marry. She had one other relationship in the other little town, Beardsley. That didn't work out. From that point on, she said, I'm going to, I won't even pursue romantic relationships anymore after that. Now, the way she negotiated some of these you look at how much authority she had over men from the 20s on. You're kind of shocked. And I asked folks, well, how did you pull that off? And I think that so many things that she was able to do, she was able to do it because she was pretty diplomatic. I only found one time when she ever said that she preached. She always taught, and she could preach from the pulpit on Sunday night, for example, but because it was Sunday night, it was teaching, it wasn't preaching. But she did call herself a preacher one time, but only once and only to a letter to a dear friend. Otherwise, she was a teacher. So again, Elise, I'm not sure I answered that completely. I think one of the women that I spoke to, in fact, Colleen Evans she was one of these movie stars. She quit the business, became a very prominent author and lecturer. She wrote a lot of books back in the 50s and 60s. But Colleen said, she didn't talk about feminism, but she lived it. Which, again, I'm not sure I completely understand that. But again, Colleen Evans was very close to her, one of her kind of girls, if you will. And that's the kind of attitude she had. So I think she was diplomatic, she finessed things. And I think she just was able to get along with pretty much everyone. Now, she doesn't mean she always, got along with everybody. But, you look at the circles that she ran in, I think you have that sense that, again, this woman is a diplomat, but she knows how to get what she wants, too. So I don't know if that's a very definitive answer, but that's about the best I can do. She's still an enigma to me. Yeah, Keith.
Mig, this was great. Thank you. So when I look at the lists of people that she influenced, and some of them were my seminary professors, pastors that I would listen to their preaching. When you look at the list, it looks like most, if not all, are Presbyterian. And in fact, if you think about, I'm guessing that she had a huge influence on the Presbyterian Church in this region. I mean, because so many of them are West Coast people that you've listed there. How influential was she outside the Presbyterian fold? In other words, she comes as a Baptist to First Pres, and that becomes kind of her, you might say, orbit. Or did she have much influence outside Presbyterian circles?
Yeah, good question. I think she's the author of what I've called West Coast Presbyterianism, and that's probably another lecture. But so the West Coast, you look at most of the large Presbyterian churches on the West Coast, even the Colorado, First Pres Colorado Springs, for example. Those are her guys, and successive generations of her guys too, that are pastors and co-pastors and such. So her influence was actually greatest on the West Coast. I mean, I think that's really true. But through Gospel Light, she traveled all over the world for Gospel Light. I mean, she spoke at conferences all over the place. And Harold John Auchengay, who was a pastor of Park Street Church, and that was a major bulwark of evangelicalism on the East Coast. In fact, he was the one that really wanted her to come to Fuller. He was pushing for her to come to Fuller as the first professor of Christian education. So she has contacts through the National Association of Evangelicals and some of these other organizations. Billy Graham Crusade. Billy Graham had her come to she went to Haringey Crusade, for some of you know Billy Graham, the tremendously significant crusade in England in the 50s. So she had these other connections. And, I didn't have a chance to talk about the different churches that used gospel light stuff. But Methodist churches, independent churches, she actually allowed Amy Semple McPherson's International Church of the Foursquare Gospel to alter gospel light materials to include their theological distinctives. She did the same thing for the Baptist Convention in Colorado. So through those kinds of institutions or programs, I think she had a really large influence on a lot of other folks too. And again, if I had more time, you could see that just all kinds of denominations, again, not just nationally, but internationally too. So, yeah.
I was curious, you said that the only state that gospel light never actually entered into was Alabama. Was there any specific reason that you found related to that? That was really interesting that it was the only state, especially because if it wasn't in Alabama, it would be interesting of looking at that whole belt down in the south of other states that may have had similar, I guess, issues if that were the reason.
Mm-hmm. No, in fact, I bet that later, that was just a particular year, that up to 1940, I think it was, Alabama was the only state that had used her stuff. Well, it was only 7 years old. That Gospel Light was only 7 years old then. So I'm sure in subsequent years, Alabama churches developed or used her stuff too, but I just don't have the information there. I think it was just an outlier at that point. Yeah. Good. Yeah, I think a lot of her teaching still is alive in a lot of these churches that have had subsequent, generations of her guys as ministers. I think that in so many ways, the kind of evangelicalism that we see played out in the media and talked about so much in the media is a different kind of evangelicalism than Mears would, I think, agree with. But I think even though her influence is still around, people don't know it's her influence. See, and that's why I use me as an example. I had no idea that I was that influenced by her. So I think her influence is still great, but I think a lot of people don't realize that. For example, if you ever worked with Young Life, that whole program is essentially, he built his program on what he knew about Henrietta Mears. In fact, it was one of her guys that was in the Gainesville Presbyterian Church where Jim Rayburn became youth director. He's the one that encouraged Rayburn to work with the unchurched youth. He said, I could take care of the kids in the church. You need to get the kids that are the unchurched. And the person that gave him that advice was one of Mears's early proteges. So her influence is still there. I think it's masked by a lot of the kind of stuff we're seeing now, unfortunately. Oh, did they? Was Earl Palmer there when your folks met? Yeah, okay. Earl Palmer, yeah. Earl Palmer was in my first interviews back in 2007. Yeah. Because I think University Church had, Dave Cowie was one of her first proteges. She wanted to find out when she first went to Hollywood in 28, who was the president, the student body president at USC and UCLA. Well, she found out Dave Cowie was the president. So she went and talked to him. She won him to Christ. He comes to her Sunday school. He becomes president of the college department, goes on to Princeton Seminary, and becomes a minister, and ends up at University Church in Seattle in the 30s and 40s. And then after him, Bob Munger was there, and after him, Earl Palmer or Gary Demarest was there. So these are successive generations of people that were really influenced by her. So that's intriguing, University Church. Mm-hmm.
Arlin, just to follow up on just your own biography, when you think of her influence, is it doctrinal or is it at some level a kind of emphasis on the relationship to Christ, that it's the emphasis on a personal relationship that has been so influential in your own life?
Yeah, I think that it is. Oh darn it! sorry. I think that it is very much this kind of life with Christ again, to know what it means to have Christ be Lord of your life, to kind of be the relationship that nurtures all of the relationships through the Holy Spirit. It's not doctrinal, I don't think. I didn't show this slide earlier. This is what I talk about in terms of West Coast Presbyterianism. You can see here that this really isn't too much doctrine. It's much more about the inner life. How do I understand my relationship with Christ? How do I understand my service to this world? You don't see much doctrine there, and I think that's part of the drill for her. It was all about relationship, I think, and discipleship, and then allow the Holy Spirit then to guide folks into where they should go, and they'll be fine. But no, I don't think it was doctrine very much at all.
You talked about kind of calling yourself an evangelical, like reluctantly.
Yeah.
Do you think we need a new term, or do you think we should seek to redeem that term?
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, a lot of my friends have left the evangelical movement, and I respect that. I mean, I certainly get why they have over the last 15 or 20 years. I think maybe Aaron needs to get back to a little bit to your point in terms of, is evangelicalism so tied to consumerism or so tied to business interests or whatever that it's lost its draw, or that it's so tied to American cultural norms that we can't break out of that. I want to believe that we can. Dale and I have had conversations about this over the years. I want to believe that we can redeem the evangelical movement. I'm not quite so critical as some of the folks that are writing today, Glorge and Darren Dochuk, some folks like that. They're saying, well, it's so much tied to American consumerism, it's so much tied to Americanism that it really, where does evangelicalism start and everything else end? I want to be more optimistic than that. But frankly, it's been a rough 5 or 6 years, especially. It really has.
Maybe one more question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be part of it. I think part of it too is that some historians that are just doing some great work now. It's a lot of fun to see what these different interpretations are going on. But one of them tend to argue that America is so kind of hooked in. It even uses the language of business, for example. And Henrietta Mears talked about the church's big business. She talked about Christian work. So I mean, she used that kind of language. But again, I'm a little less skeptical than some of other historians that are writing today. But yeah, the consumerist idea essentially is that you're appropriating certain methods of living in the world that emphasize acquisition. Prosperity gospel would be one example of that I think is terrible. I think the prosperity gospel has infiltrated the church, the evangelical world, and I think that's a huge mistake. So yeah, that's one good example. Mm-hmm. There are lots of others too, I think. Mm-hmm. Well, or especially with little kids. She can teach little kids, yeah.
I guess, I don't know what I'm asking. I guess just what's your stance on that, like the female's role in church?
Yeah. When I grew up with that sense that there are these different roles, that men are supposed to have these leadership roles and women are supposed to have these kinds of roles. And I think it took me quite a while to kind of think through. Now let's look at the Bible as a whole and see what happens to women. And so if you look at Miriam, who was Moses' sister, right? She had a pretty big role to play there. You look at Deborah, one of the judges, and I'm thinking, well, now wait, if women are doing this in the Old Testament, and again, you have some folks in the New, Dorcas and Priscilla, and some folks in the New Testament that are also holding these kind of leadership positions. Have we again acculturated in a patriarchal system our faith? In other words, is our life in the world conditioning our theological convictions? And I do a fair bit of study because I was raised with that sense. Wait a second, I think the Bible has a lot more to say about female leadership than I was raised with. I'm sorry, I get talking, I don't know if I answered the question or not. So.
I think we need to teach our young women that too.
Yeah, and Mears, like I said, at least one of her followers said she didn't talk feminism, she lived it. Well, I'm not sure that I would agree with that necessarily because she still lived within those boundaries, like Elise we were talking about a minute ago. She lived within those boundaries, but she was able to exert so much influence even doing that, that again, I think really transformed 20th century Christianity. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. We have some books available for purchase, and Arlin would sign them if you desire. But please join me in thanking Arlin Migliazzo.
Thank you. Thanks.